composure is rare. Not because it requires some special quality that most people are born without, not because it belongs to a certain type of person, or emerges only in those who have been through extreme circumstances. It is rare because most people have never been taught what it actually is, and so they have never deliberately trained it. It is easy to stay calm when things are going well, when the conversation is pleasant, when the outcome is already favorable, when there is no real pressure bearing down on you. Steadiness costs nothing in those moments. Anyone can appear composed when nothing is at stake. It is easy to be measured when there is no friction, when the people around you are cooperative, when plans unfold the way you expected them to, when your position is comfortable and unchallenged. Remaining calm under those conditions is not a skill. It is simply the absence of difficulty. But real composure appears in moments that demand control, in the moments where something is genuinely at risk. A conversation that begins to heat up, a sudden change in circumstances that no one anticipated, a decision that carries actual weight, where the consequences of getting it wrong are real. A moment where someone says something designed to unsettle you, and every part of your instinctive response wants to react immediately, loudly, defensively. Those are the moments that separate composure from its imitation. Have you ever noticed how quickly tension escalates when people lose control of themselves? A single sharp word, delivered without thinking, can transform a manageable disagreement into something much harder to contain. A single reaction, a visible flinch, a raised voice, a defensive posture, signals to everyone in the room that the situation has now taken control of the person who was supposed to be managing it. And once that signal is sent, it is difficult to unsend. Other people respond to it. The dynamic shifts. What could have been resolved with calm, measured engagement instead becomes entangled in emotion, in ego, in the momentum of reaction meeting reaction. This is not unusual. It is simply what happens when composure is absent. The deeper truth is this: composure is not the absence of emotion. It is not a kind of blankness, or a numbness, or a trained indifference to what is happening around you. Many people confuse composure with not feeling anything, and that confusion leads them in entirely the wrong direction. They try to suppress what they feel. They try to disconnect from the moment. They try to appear unaffected by working hard to feel nothing. And that approach almost always fails because it is working against the wrong thing. Composure is the ability to observe emotion without letting it dictate action. That is a specific and important distinction. The emotion exists. It may be frustration, or anxiety, or irritation, or something sharper. Those responses are real. The person who appears steady in a difficult moment is not a person who feels none of those things. They are a person who can feel them, notice them, and still choose what to do next, rather than having the emotion make that choice for them. Some individuals appear unshakable in high-pressure moments. You have seen them. They make decisions calmly when everyone around them is uncertain. They speak deliberately when the room is charged. They remain steady when others are beginning to falter. When the pressure is building, when the stakes are visible to everyone, they do not seem to be performing. There is no obvious effort in their steadiness. It simply appears to be how they operate. That quality did not arrive by chance. It was built, gradually, through specific patterns of thinking and responding. Through the development of particular habits that most people never consciously form. Through a kind of mental training that many people are not even aware is possible, because they have spent their lives assuming that composure is something you either have or you do not. That assumption is incorrect, and understanding why it is incorrect is where genuine training begins. By learning the patterns that create composure, you can train your mind to remain steady, even when circumstances are chaotic, not perfectly, not immediately, and not without effort, but systematically, in a way that compounds over time, building the kind of mental architecture that holds under pressure rather than fractures. That training begins not with dramatic change, but with a shift in how you understand what composure actually is. Most people notice composure only after it is lost. They do not realize in the moment before a reaction that a choice was available. The conversation escalates, the response emerges, and only afterward, sometimes minutes later, sometimes hours, does the awareness arrive that things could have gone differently. That something was said that did not need to be said. That a reaction was expressed that undermined the position they were trying to maintain. That the control they thought they had was not actually there. This is not weakness. It is the result of never having been trained to see the moment before the reaction. There is a widespread misunderstanding about what it means to be composed. Many people associate it with coolness in the sense of detachment. The idea that a composed person simply does not care as much as others. That their steadiness comes from lower emotional investment, from caring less about outcomes, from a kind of comfortable distance from whatever is at stake. And so composure gets misread as indifference, as coldness, as a kind of emotional unavailability that might be useful under pressure, but is perhaps not entirely trustworthy. This misreading has consequences. It leads people to distrust those who are steady, to interpret calmness as concealment, to assume that someone who does not react visibly must not be engaged. And it leads people who want to develop composure to worry that doing so will make them seem remote, or unapproachable, or disconnected from others. The reality is almost entirely opposite. Genuine composure is not detachment from what matters. It is the ability to remain fully present and engaged with what matters, without being swept away by it. The composed person is not feeling less, they are managing more. They are holding the weight of the moment without making the moment heavier by adding reactivity to it. This distinction matters because it changes the nature of the training. If composure were simply about caring less, the training would be a kind of withdrawal, learning to distance yourself from outcomes, to lower your investment, to stop letting things affect you. But that is not what produces genuine steadiness. It produces numbness. It produces the appearance of calm, alongside a slow disconnection from the things that give engagement its quality. Real composure is built through a different mechanism entirely. It is built through learning to remain engaged with difficult moments without being pulled into reactive patterns. It is the product of mental discipline, not the suppression of feeling, but the development of a space between feeling and responding. Mental discipline is a term that sounds demanding, perhaps even severe. But it is more practical than it appears. It is simply the trained capacity to direct the mind's activity rather than simply experiencing whatever the mind produces. Most people move through their days in a largely reactive mode. Thoughts arise and are believed immediately. Emotions surface and are acted on without examination. Events occur and trigger responses that feel automatic, that carry the weight of habit and conditioning, that emerge fully formed before any conscious choice has been made. Mental discipline is the gradual development of the capacity to interrupt that automatic sequence. Not to stop it entirely, not to prevent thoughts from arising or emotions from surfacing, but to introduce a point of observation between the stimulus and the response. A moment, sometimes very brief, where the mind registers what is happening without immediately converting it into action. This is the foundation on which composure is built. Everything else rests on this. The training of this capacity is not complicated to understand, though it takes genuine, sustained effort to develop. It begins with the simple recognition that the gap between stimulus and response exists at all. That there is a moment, however small, where a different choice is possible. Many people have never consciously identified that moment. They experience the stimulus and the response as continuous, as essentially the same event. The provocative comment and the sharp reply, the unwelcome news and the immediate flood of anxiety, the unexpected challenge and the defensive reaction. These feel like single events, not two-part sequences with a gap between them. But the gap is there, and learning to inhabit it, even briefly, even imperfectly, is the beginning of something that compounds considerably over time. Before that gap can be used, it must be recognized. And before it can be recognized in the moments that count, it must be identified in smaller, lower, stakes situations where the pressure is less intense and the margin for error is wider. The early signs of internal agitation are the signals that make this recognition possible. Every person has a characteristic pattern of internal agitation. The specific content varies. One person's early agitation shows up as a tightening in the chest. Another experiences it as a subtle acceleration of thought. Another notices a particular kind of mental narrowing, where the range of options they are considering seems to compress and contract. Some people experience it physically, in the body, before they experience it consciously, as an emotion. Others notice a shift in how they are processing information, a decrease in patience, an increase in the speed at which they are moving through their own thinking. These early signals matter enormously, because they are the indicators that composure is under pressure before the pressure has become overwhelming. They are the equivalent of early warning, the signs that something is building internally that, if unaddressed, will influence behavior in ways that are not chosen but simply happen. Most people either do not notice these signals, or they notice them too late, after the reaction has already begun rather than before. The cultivation of composure depends substantially on developing awareness of these signals earlier, in their initial stages, when there is still significant room to work with. This is not about suppressing the agitation when it appears. That approach fails reliably. Attempting to simply stop the rising tension, to push it down, to override it with will. This does not work because internal states do not respond well to direct force. Suppression creates pressure. The state that was pushed down does not disappear, it finds other channels. It emerges in tone, in the sharpness of language, in body language that communicates what the words are attempting to conceal. Or it builds until it can no longer be contained and erupts with more force than it would have had if it had been acknowledged early. The alternative is observation, and observation is a specific mental act, not simply passive awareness. To observe emotion rather than act on it is to notice its presence, recognize its nature, allow it to exist without either amplifying it or suppressing it, and to maintain the capacity to think clearly alongside it. This sounds deceptively simple. In practice, it requires a quality of mental attention that most people have not deliberately trained. The key is in the word, alongside. The emotion exists, the clarity exists. Both are present simultaneously. The person experiencing frustration in a difficult conversation can feel the frustration fully and also think clearly about what they want to achieve and how to respond in a way that serves that objective. The frustration does not have to be eliminated in order for clear thinking to occur. It has to be observed rather than immediately converted into behavior. This capacity, holding an emotion in awareness without acting on it, develops through practice in ordinary circumstances, not only in the high-pressure moments where the stakes are highest, but in the smaller irritations and minor frustrations that occur throughout ordinary days. The slight impatience at a delay, the mild annoyance at something that has not gone as expected, the brief flicker of irritation at something that is, when examined honestly, not significant. These smaller moments are the training ground, because the same mechanism that allows you to observe minor frustration without immediately reacting is the mechanism that, trained consistently, will hold in moments of considerably greater pressure. The gap does not suddenly appear when needed. If it has never been practiced, it develops gradually through repeated use in the lower stakes situations that fill ordinary days. There is a particular mental movement that deepens this practice considerably. It is the movement from experiencing emotion to noticing that you are experiencing emotion, the shift from "I am frustrated" to "there is frustration present." This is not a philosophical distinction without practical consequence. It is a functional shift in how the mind relates to its own internal states, and it has a real and measurable effect on the degree of control that is available. When you are inside an emotion, when you are, in that sense, identical with it, it is very difficult to act independently of it. The frustration is not an object you are examining. It is the medium through which you are currently perceiving everything. The person who has said something that frustrated you appears through the lens of that frustration. The options available to you are filtered through it. The words you choose emerge from it. Everything is colored by the state you are inside. When you are observing an emotion, when there is a small but real distance between your awareness and the state being observed, a different quality of engagement becomes available. The frustration is still there. It is still felt. But there is something in you that is watching it rather than being it. And from that watching position, it becomes possible to act rather than simply react. This shift does not happen automatically. It requires practice, and specifically it requires the kind of practice that happens in quiet. In the moments that are not under pressure, where the habit of observation can be formed without the added difficulty of managing an active crisis. The practice is simpler than it might appear. It begins with the regular habit of noticing internal states as they arise. Not to judge them, not to change them, but simply to register them with some precision. There is tension in the shoulders. There is a quality of urgency in the thinking. There is something that feels like mild resistance. These are observations. They are the beginning of the habit of treating internal states as information rather than as automatic instructions. Over time, this habit of observation generalizes. It becomes more available in progressively more challenging circumstances. The person who can observe mild frustration in quiet gradually develops the capacity to observe moderate frustration in a minor conflict. The person who can observe moderate frustration in minor conflict gradually becomes capable of observing significant emotional pressure in genuinely difficult circumstances. The skill develops through the same mechanism as any other skill, through repeated, deliberate practice across varying levels of difficulty. The mental pause that preserves clarity is one of the most concrete and practical tools available. It is not metaphorical. It is a real, specific, behavioral act. The deliberate introduction of a brief delay between the moment of stimulus and the moment of response, and its effects on both the quality of the response and the perception of the person delivering it are significant. There is a common assumption that quick responses signal competence, that the person who answers immediately, who matches pace with pace, who maintains the speed of the exchange, that this person is more capable, more confident, more in command than the person who takes a moment before responding. This assumption is widespread, and it is largely incorrect. Quick responses that emerge from incomplete processing are often imprecise, sometimes counterproductive, and frequently reveal the internal state of the person making them in ways that undermine their position. The sharp reply that escapes before it has been examined, the defensive statement that communicates vulnerability rather than strength, the hasty commitment to a position that turns out to be poorly considered. These are the costs of prioritizing speed over quality of response. The deliberate pause does something different. It signals nothing except that the person is thinking. In reality, it provides the space necessary for a very specific internal process to occur. The decoupling of the emotional content of a moment from the rational determination of what response would actually be useful. Under pressure, the mind tends toward speed. This is a functional response to perceived threat. Faster processing, faster decisions, faster action. But the speed that is useful in a physical emergency is often counterproductive in a social or professional pressure situation. The speed comes at the cost of precision. The mind reaches for the first available response rather than the most useful one. It operates on the most immediate interpretation rather than the most accurate one. The pause interrupts this. Even a pause of a few seconds creates enough space for a different quality of mental processing to engage. Not necessarily a complete analysis. There is rarely time for that, but a shift from the most automatic response to something slightly more considered. A shift from the first available interpretation to one that has been briefly tested. What happens in that pause, internally, is important. It is not simply an absence of response. It is a moment of rapid but genuine assessment. What is actually being asked or said here? What do I actually want to achieve in this exchange? What response would serve that objective, rather than simply discharge the internal pressure I am currently feeling? Those three questions, held even briefly and imperfectly in the moment of the pause, change the quality of what follows. There is also the matter of the body. Composure is not only a mental event. It has a physical dimension that is easy to overlook because the emphasis on mental training is appropriate and necessary. But the body and the mind are not separate systems, and what happens in one affects the other in ways that are direct and functional. When internal agitation rises, the body responds in characteristic ways. Breathing shallows and accelerates. Muscle tension increases, most noticeably in the shoulders, the jaw, the hands. The posture often shifts in ways that contract the body slightly, as if preparing for impact. Heart rate rises. These physical changes are not simply side effects of the mental state. They are part of it, and they feed back into the mental experience, reinforcing and amplifying the agitation. This feedback loop runs in both directions. Just as mental agitation produces physical changes, deliberate physical regulation can influence the mental state. This is not mystical. It is straightforwardly mechanical. A slow, deliberate exhalation activates the mechanisms that reduce the urgency of the agitation response. A conscious relaxation of held tension in the jaw or shoulders reduces the physical signals that the body is sending to the mind about the severity of the current situation. None of this resolves the external situation, but it changes the internal environment in which you are processing the external situation, and that change has real consequences for the quality of the thinking that is available to you. The deliberate regulation of breath during pressure is worth understanding as a practical tool rather than as a wellness practice. The mechanics are simple. The exhale, specifically the extended, controlled exhale, activates the physiological response that counteracts the agitation state. Not perfectly, not instantaneously, but reliably and usefully. A person who learns to deliver a slow, controlled exhale in the moment of rising pressure is giving themselves a small but real adjustment in their internal environment at exactly the moment when that adjustment is most needed. The internal rhythm, the pace at which thoughts are moving, the rate at which the mind is processing and responding, is related to and influenced by the physical state. When the physical state is one of heightened arousal, the internal rhythm accelerates. Thoughts move faster, connections are made more rapidly, but with less precision. The mind skips steps. It jumps from observation to conclusion without examining the intermediate reasoning. It treats interpretation as fact. It generates a sense of certainty that is actually the byproduct of speed, rather than the product of accuracy. Slowing the internal rhythm, even slightly, changes this. It is not about thinking slowly in a situation that requires rapid response. It is about resisting the pull toward a pace that sacrifices quality. Under pressure, the mind will naturally want to move faster than is useful. Recognizing this pull and gently countering it, returning the internal rhythm to something measured, is one of the more practical and immediately applicable aspects of composure training. One of the less obvious but consistently important sources of reactive behavior is the ego's relationship to external events. Ego, in the sense used here, is not arrogance or self-importance, though it can manifest in those forms. It is the part of the self that is invested in being seen in a particular way, in maintaining a particular image or status in any given interaction. It is the part that takes certain things personally that were not, in fact, directed personally. It is the part that perceives challenge as attack, disagreement as disrespect, and difference in opinion as a threat to identity. When this part of the self is dominant, in a difficult moment, it produces a characteristic kind of reactivity. The response is not to the actual content of the situation, to the problem, the disagreement, the challenge, but to the perceived threat to how the self is being seen. The anger is not really about the thing being argued about. It is about the sense that one's competence, or intelligence, or authority, or judgment is being questioned. The defensive posture is not really a defense of a position. It is a defense of the image one has of oneself. This distinction is important because it reveals the actual source of a significant portion of reactive behavior. Most of what derails composure in interpersonal situations is not the objective difficulty of the situation. It is the ego's interpretation of the situation as a threat to the self. Strip away that interpretation, and the situation very often becomes considerably more manageable. Separating the ego from external triggers is not the same as becoming indifferent to outcomes or abandoning self-respect. It is the development of the capacity to engage with the actual content of a situation, the real problem, the actual disagreement, the genuine challenge, rather than with the story the ego is constructing about what the situation means about you. This requires a particular kind of honesty with oneself. In the moment of rising reaction, the question that matters is not, "What is this person saying?" but, "What is my reaction actually responding to?" If the answer of the reaction is less about the content of the exchange and more about how the exchange is making you feel about yourself, about being seen as wrong, or weak, or uncertain, or uninformed, then the source of the reactivity has been identified, and that identification creates the possibility of separating the real situation from the ego's story about it. A composed person can be told they are wrong without the experience of personal attack. They can disagree without needing the other person to capitulate. They can be uncertain about something without that uncertainty becoming intolerable. They can hold their position under pressure without the position becoming identical to their identity, so that updating the position, if the evidence warrants it, does not feel like a defeat. This is a quality that takes time to develop. It is not produced by a single insight, but the insight itself. That much of reactive behavior is ego-generated rather than situation-generated, creates a different frame through which high-pressure moments can be examined. Conflict and disagreement are among the most reliable tests of composure, not because they are inherently more difficult than other kinds of pressure, but because they are inherently interpersonal, and the interpersonal dimension activates the ego mechanisms, the defensive responses, the instinct to be heard and validated and seen as correct, in ways that abstract challenges do not. When the pressure is coming from another person, the body reads it as social threat. The internal systems that manage status and belonging and reputation respond. The stakes feel higher than they might objectively be. Remaining composed in conflict begins with a clear-eyed understanding of what the conflict is actually about. Very often, when two people are in disagreement, each is responding to a different version of the situation, a version shaped by their own history, their own assumptions, their own interpretation of what the other person means and intends. The heat of a conflict is frequently the heat of two people arguing with their own interpretations of each other, rather than with each other directly. The composed person in a conflict is the one who can stay with the actual content of the disagreement, the real point of difference, rather than allowing the exchange to drift into the territory of tone, intention, and personal grievance. This is harder than it sounds, because the signals that drive the drift are often subtle. A particular tone of voice that feels dismissive, a word choice that suggests condescension, a pause that seems to communicate impatience. These signals are real, and they affect the experience of the exchange. But allowing them to redirect the conversation away from the actual issue consistently produces worse outcomes. Staying with the content means registering the signals, noticing the tone, the word choice, the implication, and choosing deliberately not to respond to those surface elements when responding to them would derail what actually matters. It means keeping the thinking trained on the question, what is the actual disagreement here, and what would actually help resolve it? This is a specific skill. It develops through practice. And it develops more quickly when there is clear awareness that it is being developed. The person who enters a disagreement with the conscious intention of maintaining focus on content, rather than drifting into reactive engagement, is developing something real, even when the execution is imperfect. There is also the specific challenge of disagreeing without escalating. Escalation in a conflict follows a recognizable pattern. One person's response increases the emotional temperature slightly. The other person's response matches and slightly exceeds it. The first person responds to the increase. The cycle continues. Each step seems individually justified. Each person is responding to what they received, not initiating something new. But the cumulative effect is a significant increase in the heat of the exchange that neither person consciously chose. Breaking this pattern requires one person to respond at a lower temperature than they received. Not a dramatically lower temperature that can read as condescension, as if one person is managing the other, but measurably lower. The voice that stays level when the other person's has risen. The pace that remains unhurried when the other person has accelerated. The word choice that stays precise when the other person's has become imprecise. This is not concession. It is management, and it has a reliable effect. The escalation cycle depends on reciprocal escalation to continue. When one person consistently fails to match the temperature of the incoming communication, the cycle cannot sustain itself. The heat gradually drops back to a level where the actual content of the disagreement can be addressed. The strategic power of silence is consistently underused. Silence, in the context of conflict or pressure, is not the absence of response. It is a response. One that carries specific signals and produces specific effects in the people receiving it. A composed silence communicates something quite different from an uncomfortable silence, and developing the capacity to use silence deliberately is a meaningful part of composure training. Most people find silence in high-pressure moments uncomfortable. The absence of words in an intense exchange creates a kind of internal pressure to fill the gap, to say something, to respond, to keep the exchange moving. This pressure is strong enough that people frequently say things they do not actually mean, or have not fully considered, simply to relieve the discomfort of silence. The composed person can sit with that discomfort, can allow silence to exist in a moment where most people would immediately fill it, and the effect is considerable. It signals unhurried deliberation. It signals that the person is not driven by the need to respond quickly. It signals that whatever comes next will be measured rather than reflexive. These signals are read clearly, even unconsciously, by the people present. Silence also creates a particular kind of space in the other person. When someone delivers a sharp comment, and the response is not the immediate defensive reaction they anticipated, but a calm, brief silence, it disrupts the expected dynamic. The sharp comment was prepared as part of a sequence: provocation, defense, counter, provocation, escalation. When the sequence is interrupted, the person who delivered the sharp comment is left with it, unreinforced by the expected response. They may begin to soften it themselves. They may clarify it or qualify it in ways they would not have if the immediate defensive reaction had kept the dynamic moving at its usual pace. None of this is manipulation in any meaningful sense. It is simply the recognition that a considered response even one that arrives after a brief silence, is typically more effective than an immediate reaction. And that silence, when used deliberately rather than helplessly, is a communicative act rather than an absence. Why steady individuals influence others more effectively is a question worth examining directly, because the relationship between composure and influence is real, but not always immediately obvious. Influence is not the same as authority. Authority can be assigned through position, through title, through the structures of organizations and hierarchies. Influence is generated by the perception of those in proximity. It is the degree to which other people allow their thinking to be shaped by contact with a particular person, and that perception is heavily shaped by the qualities that composure produces. The composed person in a high-pressure situation becomes a reference point when uncertainty is spreading through a group, when a situation is ambiguous, when the appropriate response is unclear, when anxiety is rising. People orient toward the person who appears most steady. This is not a conscious decision in most cases. It is a social response to a signal that says, this person has processed the situation and is not alarmed. That signal carries information, even when the situation is genuinely uncertain. The measuredness of the composed person's response is itself communicative. When someone speaks slowly and precisely under pressure, those listening tend to assume that the slowness and precision reflect underlying certainty and competence. When someone's voice remains level while others rise, the leveled voice is interpreted as evidence of control, not necessarily certainty about outcomes, but control over the process of arriving at the response. Over time, the person who consistently demonstrates composure across a range of situations builds a reputation for it. Others know, through experience, that this person can be depended upon not to add the cost of reactivity to an already difficult situation. They know that decisions made by this person will reflect the actual demands of the situation, rather than the emotional state of the moment. They know that in conflict, the composed person can be trusted not to escalate unnecessarily. This builds a particular kind of trust that is very difficult to build through other means. It is not the trust that comes from warmth, or from demonstrated competence in technical matters, or from consistency of values. Though those things matter too, it is the trust that comes from demonstrated reliability under pressure, and that kind of trust generates influence in a way that is cumulative and durable. Impulsive responses have a cost that is often only visible in retrospect. An impulsive response is not simply a fast response. It is a response that prioritizes the discharge of internal pressure over the achievement of the external objective. It is the sharp word that provides the momentary relief of having said something, at the cost of a relationship, or a negotiation, or a perception that would have been better served by a different choice. It is the defensive statement that provides the momentary comfort of protecting the self-image at the cost of the credibility that measured engagement would have produced. The impulsive response feels, in the moment, like the natural response. It feels like what the situation requires. The person who has delivered it often cannot immediately identify what would have been better. The impulse was acting as the only available option, and the space in which alternatives could have been generated never opened. Detaching from impulsive responses is therefore not primarily about will, about simply deciding not to react impulsively. It is about the systematic widening of the mental space in which alternatives can be generated. When the space exists, the alternative often appears. It does not need to be constructed through effort, it simply needs room. This widening happens through the practices already described. The development of observational distance from emotional states, the cultivation of the pause, the slowing of internal rhythm. But there is another element worth naming explicitly, the mental habit of asking, in the moment before response, what the objective actually is. This question, what am I actually trying to achieve here, is simple but consistently powerful. It works because impulsive responses are very rarely aligned with the actual objective. The actual objective in a difficult conversation might be to reach an agreement, or to understand the other person's position, or to preserve a working relationship while addressing a real problem. The impulsive response is typically aimed at none of those things. It is aimed at the immediate relief of the internal pressure, at having said the thing, at having defended the position, at having matched the energy of what was incoming. When the actual objective is held clearly in mind, the impulsive response becomes less attractive, not because it is suppressed, but because it is seen clearly for what it is, a response that serves the internal pressure at the expense of the external objective. That clarity, applied consistently, is itself a training mechanism. Over time, the habit of checking responses against objectives becomes faster, more automatic, more available in the moments where it is most needed. Maintaining clarity when events become unpredictable is a specific challenge that deserves direct attention. Predictability is comfortable for the mind. When events unfold as anticipated, the mental processing required is relatively light. The situation is being managed by the frameworks already in place. When events become unpredictable, those frameworks are challenged or invalidated, and the mind must work harder, and under that increased demand, the quality of the thinking tends to fall before it rises. The initial response to unpredictability is typically a form of mental contraction. The range of options being considered narrows. The thinking becomes more rigid, more defensive, more committed to the last available certainty, rather than open to new information. This is understandable. Certainty is stabilizing, and losing it creates a kind of internal turbulence that the mind tries to resolve as quickly as possible, often by reaching for the nearest available explanation or course of action rather than the most accurate or useful one. Maintaining composure when events are unpredictable requires resisting this contraction. It requires the capacity to remain in a state of genuine uncertainty without either forcing premature closure, convincing yourself you know what is happening when you do not, or becoming destabilized by the uncertainty itself. This is a more demanding version of the same basic skill that underlies all composure training, the ability to hold a difficult internal state without immediately converting it into behavior. In this case, the difficult internal state is the discomfort of not knowing, and the behaviors it pushes toward. Premature certainty, defensive rigidity, the artificial narrowing of options, are the ones that most undermine effective response to genuinely unpredictable situations. The composed response to unpredictability is something like, I do not yet know what is happening here, and that is the current condition of the situation. What do I actually know? What are the genuinely open questions? What is the most useful next action given that uncertainty? This sounds like a rational algorithm, and in some sense it is. But it is also, underneath that, an act of composure. Because maintaining the openness to uncertainty, resisting the pull toward premature resolution, staying in the harder and more demanding state of not yet knowing. These are not natural tendencies. They require training. They require the same kind of deliberate cultivation of mental steadiness that applies to the more interpersonal dimensions of composure. The person who can remain genuinely open in the face of unpredictability, who does not panic into false certainty, who does not contract defensively, who continues to think clearly about what is actually known and what is not, is a considerably more effective decision maker than the person who cannot. The unpredictability itself has not changed, but the quality of the processing it receives has. The development of awareness of triggers is an important and nuanced aspect of long-term composure training. A trigger is not simply something that produces an emotional response. Triggers are specific. They are the particular kinds of events, comments, tones, dynamics, or circumstances that reliably and disproportionately activate reactive responses in a given individual. Everyone has them. They are not signs of weakness or failure. They are the product of history, of learned associations, of experiences that shaped how certain kinds of stimuli are processed. What matters for composure training is not whether you have triggers. Everyone does. But whether you are aware of them, and whether that awareness influences how you relate to them when they arise. Most people are not particularly aware of their specific triggers. They experience the reactive response and attribute it to the current situation. This conversation is making me angry. This person is frustrating me. This development is causing anxiety. The attribution is external, and it locates the source of the response entirely in the outside situation. When trigger awareness is developed, the attribution becomes more nuanced and more accurate. This type of comment, in this type of dynamic, produces this particular kind of reaction in me. This is a pattern that I recognize. This is my trigger responding, not only the external situation speaking. This shift in attribution is consequential. When the source of the response is located partially inside, in the pattern rather than only in the current event, it becomes possible to respond to the trigger with some degree of preparedness, rather than only with surprise. The trigger still activates. The response still arises, but it arises in a context where it is recognized, named, and therefore slightly less automatic. The development of trigger awareness requires honest retrospective examination. After a reactive episode, after a moment where composure was lost, the useful question is not simply, what happened, but what specifically activated the reaction? The answer is often more specific than it initially appears. It is not just, that person was disrespectful, but that particular tone, in that particular context, reliably produces a defensive response in me. The specificity matters because it is the specific pattern that, once identified, can be tracked and managed. Over time, a clear map of personal triggers develops through this kind of examination, and the map itself becomes a resource, not a reason for self-criticism or a catalogue of vulnerabilities, but a practical guide to the situations and dynamics that require the most deliberate application of composure practices. There is something important to understand about the relationship between composure and sustained mental training. Composure is not a threshold that, once crossed, is permanently held. It is not the case that a person reaches a certain point in their development and is thereafter composed in all circumstances. It is a practice, something maintained and developed through ongoing effort, something that deepens over time through continued use, something that can be eroded by extended neglect just as physical fitness can be eroded by extended inactivity. This means that the training does not end. There is no arrival point. There is only the quality of the practice at any given stage of development, and the gradual deepening of that practice through continued engagement with the circumstances that test it. This is not discouraging. It is simply accurate, and accuracy about what composure requires is more useful than inflated expectations that set the practice up to seem like a failure when the inevitable difficult moments arise. The inevitable difficult moments are part of the training, not interruptions to it. Every time composure is tested, every high-pressure conversation, every moment of unpredictability, every activation of a known trigger is a training event. It is an opportunity to apply the practices, to observe the results, to identify what held and what did not, and to carry that information forward into the next occasion. Composure is built through these accumulated occasions, not through any single dramatic moment of transformation, but through the gradual, consistent, accumulating evidence that the practices work, that the pause preserved clarity, that the observation prevented escalation, that the slowed internal rhythm produced a better response than speed would have. Each instance of this evidence strengthens the neural patterns and the behavioral habits on which composure depends. Long-term training also gradually shifts the default. The person who begins their composure training from a position of frequent reactivity and works consistently over time does not simply learn to apply the practices consciously as needed. The practices, through repetition, become less effortful. The pause becomes more natural. The observational distance from emotional states becomes more readily available. The internal rhythm resists the pull toward pressure, induced speed with less deliberate effort. The default state of the mind changes. This is not a fast change. It is a change that requires genuine, sustained commitment, but it is a real change, not merely a learned performance, but an actual shift in the characteristic way the mind operates under pressure. There is a quality that composure builds over time that is difficult to name precisely, but consistently recognized by those who encounter it. It is something in the presence of the person, the way they occupy a room, the way they engage in a conversation, the way they hold themselves when the stakes are high. It is not loudness or assertion. It is a kind of weight, a quality of unhurried intentionality that people register without always being able to articulate what they are registering. This quality is built by the accumulated history of measured responses, by the consistent choice, over many occasions, to pause rather than react, to observe rather than be swept away, to respond to the actual situation rather than to the emotional charge around it. It is not performed. It cannot be performed, not sustainably. It is produced by the practice itself, emerging gradually as the internal architecture of composure becomes more stable. The effect on trust is particular and worth examining. Trust, in many of its most important forms, depends on predictability, not on the prediction that things will go well, but on the prediction that a person will behave consistently with who they have shown themselves to be, regardless of the circumstances. The composed person provides a specific kind of predictability. They can be expected not to escalate unnecessarily, not to make decisions that serve their emotional state at the expense of the actual situation, not to create additional problems through reactive behavior in moments that already have enough difficulty. This predictability is deeply valuable in any context where people must rely on each other under pressure. It is the kind of trust that is built slowly through evidence, through the repeated demonstration that the person's behavior remains steady across varying levels of difficulty. And it is the kind of trust that, once built, constitutes a genuine form of authority. One that does not need to announce itself, because it is simply present in how the person operates. The subtle ways composure builds trust and authority are worth naming precisely because they are subtle. They do not produce immediate, dramatic recognition. They accumulate. The impression they build is gradual, and the person doing the building may not receive direct feedback that it is happening. But the effect is real, and it deepens over time in proportion to the consistency of the practice. Perception in leadership and decision-making is shaped substantially by how responses are delivered, not only by their content. Two people can give the same answer to the same question. One delivers it with tension in the voice, with slight haste, with the body language of someone who is slightly on the back foot. The other delivers it with a measured pace, a level voice, and the physical ease of someone who is not troubled by the question. The content is identical, the perception of the two is not. This is not about performance or image management. It is about the reality that communication is more than content, and that the manner of delivery carries information about the state of the person delivering it. Haste signals uncertainty. Defensiveness signals vulnerability. Tension signals that the situation has activated something in the person that has not been processed. All of these are readable, and they are read by the people in the room, whether or not anyone is consciously attending to them. The composed person's manner of delivery signals something different, that the question has been received, processed, and responded to from a position of stability rather than reactivity. This signal is not produced by effort applied to the performance of steadiness. It is produced by the actual internal state, by the genuine presence of the composure practices under the surface of the delivery. This is why training composure internally is what produces it externally. There is no shortcut that produces genuine steadiness from the outside in. The attempt to perform composure without the internal state that produces it is readable as performance, often more clearly than the reactivity it is attempting to conceal. In decision-making, the connection is direct. Decisions made from a reactive state are worse decisions, on average, than decisions made from a state of composure, not because reactivity produces stupid thinking, but because it produces a specific kind of bias toward the most immediately available solution, toward the option that resolves the internal discomfort most quickly, toward the choice that protects the ego rather than the choice that serves the actual objective. Composure does not guarantee good decisions. Accuracy of information, quality of reasoning, and the inherent uncertainty of complex situations all matter, but composure removes one of the most consistent sources of decision-making degradation, the distortion introduced by an unregulated emotional state. Remove that distortion, and the quality of the thinking that remains is substantially higher. Mental exercises that reinforce calm. Steady thinking are worth describing concretely, because the training does not happen through understanding alone. Understanding is necessary. It creates the map. But the territory is changed through practice, and practice requires specific activities, repeated with sufficient consistency to produce lasting change. One of the most useful exercises is what might be called deliberate deceleration. It is the intentional practice of slowing down in situations where there is no external pressure to do so. taking extra time with a response that does not require it, deliberately resisting the pull toward efficiency in a moment where efficiency is not actually demanded. This builds the habit of choosing pace rather than simply being pulled along by circumstance. Over time, the capacity to choose pace in high-pressure situations is strengthened by the repeated experience of choosing it in low-pressure ones. Another exercise is the regular practice of retrospective examination. After any situation where composure was tested, whether successfully or not, taking a few minutes to examine what actually happened internally. What was the first sign of agitation? What was the trigger? What did the reactive impulse want to do? What was actually done? What would have been more useful? This examination is not self-criticism, it is investigation, and the information it produces is specific, cumulative, and directly applicable to the next occasion. A third practice is the deliberate introduction of moments of stillness into the ordinary day. Not extended meditation, though that has its own value for some people, but brief, intentional pauses, moments of a minute or two where the mind is allowed to rest rather than process. These moments build familiarity with a mental state that is neither active nor reactive. A state of genuine rest that becomes a reference point. Under pressure, the mind that has a familiar reference point for stillness can return to something like it more readily than the mind that has no such reference in its history. A fourth practice, and perhaps the most directly applicable to high-pressure situations, is the habit of single breath pausing. In any moment that activates agitation, before responding to a difficult message, before entering a challenging conversation, immediately after a provocation and before a response, a single, deliberate, controlled breath. It is brief. It is almost invisible. But it inserts a moment of physical regulation into the sequence between stimulus and response, and that moment is enough to change what happens next more often than the simplicity of the practice might suggest. These exercises are not dramatic. They are not the kind of training that produces immediate, visible transformation. They are the kind of training that, accumulated consistently over weeks and months, produces a gradual and real shift in how the mind operates under pressure. The change they produce is the change that actually matters, not the appearance of composure, but its substance. There is one more dimension of composure that deserves attention before any summary is reached, and it concerns the relationship between composure and the long arc of a person's character. Composure, as trained through the practices described here, does not remain separate from the rest of who a person is. It integrates. It becomes part of how the person thinks, not only how they behave under specific kinds of pressure. The observational distance from emotional states, practiced in difficult moments, gradually becomes available in all moments, making the person more accurate in their assessments, less distorted by the bias of their own internal states, more genuinely responsive to what is actually happening, rather than to their interpretations of it. The habit of examining responses against objectives, developed in conflict and high-stakes situations, begins to inform ordinary communication. The person who has trained the question, "What am I actually trying to achieve here?" applies it not only in heated exchanges, but in ordinary ones, and finds that the answers often redirect the communication towards something more useful than the habitual default would have produced. The capacity to hold uncertainty without forcing premature resolution, developed in unpredictable situations, becomes more generally available as an intellectual quality, making the person more capable of genuine inquiry, less committed to their initial interpretations, more open to information that contradicts what they expected. This integration is what turns composure from a behavioral practice into something closer to a characteristic of mind. It does not announce itself. It does not produce a different personality. It produces something quieter and more durable, a mind that operates with less friction, that is less frequently hijacked by its own reactive patterns, that can be genuinely present to whatever situation it is engaged with without the additional noise of unexamined emotion and automatic response. This is the long-term return on the investment of consistent training. It is not rapid, it is not dramatic, but it is real, and it deepens across time in ways that compound. Each increment of genuine composure, making the next increment more accessible. Composure is not something you have or lack. It is something you cultivate. Deliberately, incrementally, through specific practices applied consistently across the situations that test them. It is built in the small moments as much as the large ones, in the brief pause before a response, in the quiet examination after an incident, in the deliberate choice of pace in a moment that would have defaulted to haste. It is built in the practice of observing emotion rather than acting from inside it, in the development of familiarity with the early signals of agitation, in the gradual deepening of the space between stimulus and response. Those who appear unshakable under pressure share quiet patterns that, examined closely, are neither innate nor mysterious. They pause before reacting. Not always, not perfectly, but consistently enough that the pause has become part of how they operate. They observe their thoughts and emotional states with a quality of attention that gives them room to work with, rather than simply experiences to be swept by. They allow clarity to guide action, rather than allowing the urgency of the internal pressure to select the response. They control the internal pace in moments where external pressure is pulling toward haste. These are learnable patterns. They are not the exclusive property of a certain kind of person. They are available to anyone willing to develop them through the kind of consistent, patient, unglamorous practice that genuine mental training requires. Over time, the effects of this training become visible, not primarily to the person doing the training, who is too close to the gradual changes to see them clearly, but to the people around them. The decisions become more consistently clear. The reactions become more reliably measured. The presence becomes more substantial, not larger, not louder, but more genuinely stable. The trust that builds around a person who can be depended upon to remain steady creates a kind of authority that no amount of assertion or performance could produce. The quality of influence that composure generates is the kind that lasts. It is not the influence of the most assertive voice in the room, which rises and falls with circumstance. It is the influence of the most reliable mind, the one that, over repeated occasions, has demonstrated that it operates from clarity rather than reactivity, that it serves objectives rather than discharges pressure, that it remains functional precisely when function is most needed. And at the foundation of all of this, there is something very simple: a small space, available in every difficult moment between what happens and what you do about it. Most people, moving at the speed of reaction, never find that space. It is there, in every exchange and every provocation and every sudden demand. It is there in the moment before the sharp reply escapes. It is there in the fraction of a second before the defensive posture closes. It is there in the beat, before the premature commitment to a position that has not been fully examined. The next time you feel tension rise, in a conversation that is becoming difficult, in a situation that is becoming uncertain, in a moment that is pressing toward reaction, there will be that small space before the response. It will be brief. It will require attention to recognize. It will be easy to miss if you are moving at the pace the pressure is demanding. But when you recognize it, that space becomes the foundation of unshakable composure. Not in a single moment, not completely, but gradually, through practice, through accumulated use, through the slow and genuine development of the mental architecture that holds under pressure. That is how this quality is built. Steadily, over time, through the consistent, precise, unglamorous work of training the mind to respond rather than react. That work is available to anyone who takes it seriously.